Good morning. It's a little early. It's just about 6 o'clock. I arrived here yesterday afternoon and got some nice pictures as the sun was setting, but I wanted to come back this morning while the wind was died down and it wasn't too breezy, so we could take another closer look at Mission San Xavier del Bac. This mission has been here. It was actually finished around the turn of the 18th century, 1797 or so. It was started about 10 or 15 years earlier, but it's not the original mission. The original mission was a couple of miles away, and it was built around 1690 and 1692 by a Father Padre Kino, who established a series of missions in this area, similar to the Franciscans that established missions in Southern California, but this is much earlier. And Kino was a Jesuit priest, and the original church, which was destroyed during an Apache raid, was rebuilt here, but the Jesuits didn't build this. At that time, Spanish ruler Charles III was dissatisfied with the Jesuits. He really didn't trust them, so he sent a group of Franciscans here. And it was Franciscans also who established the missions in Southern California. That was Father Juniper Sierra. And they were a little bit different than the Franciscans that came here, apparently. Father Kino was very friendly with the native O'odham tribe, the indigenous people that lived here, so friendly that they helped him build the original church, and they actually helped the Franciscans build this church too. What we have then here is an example of Spanish colonial architecture that was designed in the late 18th century and is a really good example of the Churrigueresque style. The Churrigueresque style is unique to Spain, and it has some really interesting background. As we get in close here, we'll be able to identify some of the origin of the Churrigueresque style. And it really, surprisingly enough, it's Moorish. In fact, they describe the church here as a Spanish colonial church with a heavy Moorish influence. And what we're going to explore is what the word Moorish truly means. I'm Gary Katz. I'm making this my first stop on an architectural tour across the country, shooting pictures of historic homes and sites that are important to me and important to the Mantelpiece book that I've been working on for the last 20 years. That'll be published in 2023, hopefully. And this building is particularly important to me because it kind of started my interest and my enthusiasm in architecture. I visited here 20 years ago, and a close friend described the balustrade on the second floor there beneath the base of the towers, described that balustrade as a crenellated wall, and it's not. But I believed him for a long, long time. That's just a balustrade. A crenellated wall is really those kind of castles, those parapet walls on castles that archers used to stand behind, and they'd pour hot oil on them and stuff like that over them. That's just a balustrade with little kind of like arch top railing on it. And the towers themselves are incomplete. The right tower was never finished. The Franciscans ran out of money. The church has been restored several times. The best restoration was just recently. The prior one, they sealed the outside of the building a little too well, and it trapped moisture inside the wall, and it caused a lot of decay. But they never completed the right-hand tower, and that's why it has that asymmetrical look, but that's not the way it was designed, even though it is quite attractive with that kind of those asymmetrical towers. And if we're standing back here, we should look kind of close even from here, just to notice that there are flying buttresses that are supporting the bases of both these towers. You can see them, they have a volute shape at the tops, which is very interesting. And there are also volutes on both sides of the building. We'll get in close with the camera and get some close-up pictures of those. And those volutes are horizontal. And again, in the entranceway, there are also two more volutes flanking the entrance, the terracotta entrance, and they are vertical, which is kind of interesting. Let's get in close and take a better look. Here's another good example of an order. And this one especially is unique because it has such a tremendous Islamic kind of influence to it. It still nonetheless, though, is an order right out of those Greek temples, right out of the Parthenon. 4 columns supporting an entablature. The entablature is made up of a cornice with the crown molding and that top cap, and a corona beneath it, that flat part that has a little kind of soffit beneath it. And in some orders, remember, in some of the Greek orders, they had the triglyphs and the metape spaces and all that kind of stuff. That's not here, but it does have an architrave bead below it, that bead that creates the bottom of the entablature. So it's just like a Greek order, but significantly different than one that we've seen before. I came inside my van because I was getting kind of excited out there. I wanted to get my thoughts together so I could make this as clear as possible. There's 2 things I want to cover in the van while we're here. I want to talk about the 3 stages in the design of the exterior of that church. And I also want to talk about the Islamic influence in this architectural style. So first, the 3 stages are pretty simple. The lower columns form the first stage. The center columns form the second stage, and the upper columns that reach up into the pediment area, which we'll talk about in a second, those form the third stage. All 3 stages are almost identical. The columns are almost exactly the same elevation and height, and the design is almost exactly the same too, which breaks a classical rule in a way, a pretty important one. Renaissance architecture used the classical orders in a really kind of human way. They used the heavier ones, the Tuscan and the Doric, at the very bottom on the first stage to support this upper structure. And then in the second stage, they switched to like the Ironic or the Corinthian, something a little bit more feminine and lighter, so that the first stage, the lower columns weren't supporting too much weight, and so that the feminine columns weren't at the bottom, that's for sure. Another interesting thing about the third stage here that runs up to the pediment, there's a little section of a rake cornice up there. It almost looks like a piece of a ruin. And that upper third stage, besides that short section of rake cornice, there's a couple other really fun features. There's kind of a dog shape up there that has a cat head and a long tail wrapped around its rump. And it looks like it's chasing a mouse. There's a mouse, or something like a mouse, sitting right inside that volute on the left-hand side. Also in that top stage, in the center of that pediment, there's an emblem with a Christo icon and Christ's arms crossed in the center. Flanking that are a couple of armorial shields, and the entire remainder of the pediment, as well as the entire entrance, is filled with foliation and arabesques with grapes and assorted flowers and vines growing everywhere in definitely a Baroque manner. In the very center of the pediment at the top, and it is a pediment, it just doesn't look like one we're accustomed to. There are all sorts of open pediments that resemble this, but are considerably different. A swan's neck open pediment or a gooseneck pediment, but this one is inverted. Nonetheless, it still has what I think was a pedestal for a cross. The cross is missing, but the pedestal remains right in the center of the pediment. Sometimes it's equally important to study the architectural style and the history of the architecture too, because it helps you understand the past and why we are the way we are today. And architecture provides us with one of those keys with which we can open the door to the past and understand today better by looking at the past. We should be careful about denigrating the entire Islamic culture just because of the current Islamic terrorists. We have to be really cautious about painting things with a large brush, especially when religion and history are concerned. If it wasn't for the Islamics, we wouldn't even have Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, all of the Greek texts, all that medicine, all that science that we are dependent on. The government of the United States is based on Greek texts, and all of those texts were saved by the Islamics and translated into Arabic, and then retranslated later back into English. And that is how Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates and all of that material survives today. So now let's talk about the Islamic influence on Spanish colonial architecture, on the Churrigueresque, and on San Xavier del Bac church. Back around 622, this is AD after the death of Christ, Muhammad had a vision and a visitation with Allah, with God, in a cave in the desert of Arabia. And when he came out, he started a new religion. His tribe and his army conquered Arabia. After his death, the caliphates that followed Muhammad conquered Iraq, Iran, Syria. Now these countries, the names didn't exist at the time. In fact, Iran was really Persia. And at the same time, they conquered Egypt as well. In succeeding caliphates, and actually in the final ones, they conquered Afghanistan, they had already conquered Egypt, and they conquered northern Africa. And they also conquered all of Spain. But it wasn't until 1492 that the last Muslim emir was exiled from Spain. That's 750 years that Muslim culture was influencing Spain. And that also is what we're seeing here at San Xavier del Bac. With the dome and the parapet walls here, with the little volutes and the finials on the top, it begins to look a little bit Moorish or Islamic. I'm about to go inside the mission, so we gotta be quiet. And I have to wear my mask too. So I won't be talking too much while I'm inside the mission. The interior of the church is extremely quiet. After all, the exterior walls must be 2 feet thick. All you hear is a low hum of a fan blowing and the whispers of visitors wandering around the aisles and the naves. The church is in a cross shape, the shape of a cross. And if you look closely at the pilasters, they're exactly the same as the exterior pilasters, the exterior columns that we were looking at just a short while ago, except they're far more detailed, more delicate. They have been restored very, very nicely and recently. And that's why the church and the interior is so gorgeous. At one time, the interior of the church fell into disuse and was abandoned, like many missions. But fortunately, it was salvaged. Like I said, it was just recently restored. And you can see the results of that effort everywhere you look. Yes, there are areas of the ceilings that are so damaged that they haven't been restored. And that damage was largely due to the earlier restoration that trapped moisture in the walls and the ceiling and did lasting damage to the frescoes.